Right, we're back again. I think we are in a lot better position this time, so apologies that it's the usual hot slash up of a video, but once again, please let me know if you can hear me and what you can see on the screen. Hopefully you can see the green opening card, HOPS 2021 live workshop program, and it all looks a lot more promising. So I do apologise for the, as usual, HOPS late start. It's a good job we're not involved in anything like running a railway or anything like that, isn't it? And we will make a start again shortly. Thank you, Phil. That looks more like it. Yes, absolutely. Take two. Yep, that's right, Tom. And I'll try and start it out as if nothing ever went wrong in the first place. So thanks very much for tuning in. Hopefully everyone will come back on board. We'll just give everyone another few seconds to join. And as always, it seems no matter how early I start the preparations for these things, it always starts at 10 past whatever time it's supposed to start. So, welcome everybody once again to HOPS's 2021 live workshop program concentrating on safety management systems. This is the second safety management system workshop, and we will in a little while be looking at the management of fatigue risk and control of working hours, which you might think is not a particularly exciting or adventurous subject, but it is something that's very important, something that we have to be able to manage, and something that we have to be able to demonstrate that we are managing. And as always, there's lots of complications to be taken into account. So we'll just have a very brief recap. So just in case you didn't see the last HOPS workshop, everyone is invited to join in. Please make comments as we go along. Or if you think I've said something that's wrong, then let me know in the comments. Or if your railway does it in a slightly different way that you think is better or worse or indifferent, do please comment it in the comments. This isn't just a lecture for me to tell you how to do it right, because I'm not going to claim that I know everything there is to know about how to do it. This is a workshop where it's designed for all of us to take part and everyone to feed in. And just like I said at the last video, the workshop doesn't end when the video ends. It goes on and on and on and on forever. So please send me your comments after the video if you want to, as many of you did for the drugs and alcohol one, which was fantastic. So I'm sure that there'll be a wide range of maturities of SMSs across all the heritage railways. Some of you may be sitting there thinking that your SMS is pretty good and up to scratch, in which case that's brilliant. But it helps to take part in the workshop just in case you might have missed anything, or also to give the benefit of your experience to other people. Or if you're there thinking, our SMS could do with a bit of work, we must admit, then this is the ideal opportunity for you to pick up on the best practice that everyone else is sharing. The video will be available on YouTube afterwards, and just to confirm, the aim of all this that we're trying to achieve is to construct a set of best practice SMS templates. Hopefully it will save us all a bit of time, because at the moment we're all coming up with the same answers pretty much, or we're certainly duplicating and overlapping a lot of work just to all reinvent the wheel from scratch. So it'll save a bit of that time, it'll save a bit of the cost associated with that, and it'll enable us all to show that our work is being peer reviewed by a big number of other railways. This workshop is certainly not about saying this is what you must do. This is just one example that I have found through what you've sent me, and what I've found through my experience of working on railways in the past is what I believe a sensible way to crack the nut. I'm also certainly not saying that this is guaranteed to be suitable for every railway undertaking. You must, of course, make sure that it matches the risks that you identify that are particular to you. But I suspect a lot of us have similar or overlapping risks, and so hopefully the majority of the SMS template will work for the majority of us. Let me just realign my screen slightly. There we go. You can just about squeeze it all in. This is just a reminder. I'm not going to talk about it for ages, but a reminder of the structure of a company that I'm using in these SMS templates. Some directors or a managing director at the top, some managers of the business unit in the pink level, going down to department managers who have frontline staff underneath them. I know that in a lot of cases, in fact I think in every case, railways do not have a role called manager of the business unit, and just to confirm, that's absolutely deliberate. I've deliberately picked a word that almost nobody will already use, because I'm never going to persuade you all to have standardized job titles across all railways. So I've deliberately picked a word here that you can align to whatever role is appropriate in your organisation for somebody to be a manager of the business unit. So you might say the managers of the business unit are the operations manager, the commercial manager, and the engineering manager, for example. It's exactly the same as the word guard on the main line. The mainline railway rulebook uses the word guard here, there, and everywhere. But individual operating companies call the person who is responsible for discharging the responsibilities of a guard all different things: train manager, conductor, train captain, all sorts of other things. But they all know my role is that of the guard. So hopefully your engineering manager will have a letter written to him to say, as far as the SMS is concerned, your role is the manager of the business unit. More than happy to go over that in more detail with anyone who wants to hear about it, or I recommend you watch the first part of the previous workshop, workshop number 12. Just to confirm, all these roles are people that are appointed to those roles, and they are always that role. Whether they're on duty, off duty, at home, in bed, asleep, they are still that role in the SMS. Unlike the function supervisor, which is a shift role which might be carried out by more than one person on a shift basis. And the purpose in the SMS of the function supervisor is to be the person who's there at the time, the person who is, in this example, the duty officer or the shop duty manager, for example, at the time. A slightly different line of reporting to the head of department, manager of the business unit structure, but deliberately designed because a lot of heritage railways operate 7 days a week, especially in the summer. And we can't expect to have heads of department who quite frequently might be volunteers on duty 24/7 all the time. So it enables us to have a reporting structure that has a permanent escalation process, but also has an on-duty escalation process as well. So that was just to confirm the structure of the SMS that we're working to. Of course, you can amend the templates however you like. This is just what I'm suggesting. So if you really want to put actual job titles in, then you can do. Before you all remind me to say it, as I'm sure you would, the SMS overall document will identify who the function supervisors are in terms of job roles and who the managers of the business units are in terms of job roles. So before we launch into SMS workshop 13, we're going to go back a step, back to workshop number 12, the management of drugs and alcohol workshop that we did 6 weeks ago. Just to confirm, the video is now on YouTube. There's a screenshot of it on the left-hand side, and the output from it, all the documents and the template and all the sources are now on HOPS as well. And again, I'm going to have to rearrange each screen the first time I use it here, so just bear with me because I have to start from scratch. Here we are. So if we were to go to the workshops page in HOPS, you'll find that workshop on the workshop from the 2nd of March is now a link, and it takes you to the page where, first of all, the video is embedded. There we are. And second of all, there's all the templates and documents that form the best practice output. And there's the links of the research material that we use to create it. So you can find all that on HOPS now. I'm afraid you can only download the SMS practice template if you're an advanced HOPS customer. If you're not an advanced HOPS customer and you would like to get involved, then please let me know and we will sort out advanced HOPS for you. Now, an interesting little story just to pass on to you about the uploading of these documents. It took me about 2 weeks to do it after the last workshop. It took me about 2 weeks. And the reason why it took me 2 weeks was because, first of all, I waited a little while for more comments to come in, which they did, which was good. But even then, it took me another week to get around to uploading it. And that was because in my imagination, I thought, oh, I must get around to uploading those SMS documents onto HOPS so that everyone can download them. Oh, but I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do for a technical solution for this, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to format that. I'll put it out of my imagination, and I'll come back to it tomorrow. And tomorrow would come, and I'd think, oh, well, I could do it this way, but that's sort of not going to work because of X, Y, or Z. Oh, I don't want to think about this at the moment. I'll put it out of my mind until tomorrow. And the next day would come, and eventually, of course, I managed to do it. Eventually, I overcame all the technical parameters that I needed to think about in order to put this stuff on HOPS. None of it was to do with safety. It was all to do with websites and technicalities like that. But I felt it was a really ironic story because I'm sure that in a lot of cases, when it comes to SMSs, we think to ourselves, oh yes, we really should sort out the SMS for fencing, or we really should sort out the SMS for platform train interface, or we really should sort out the SMS for this, that, and the other. But where on earth do you start? and sometimes it's really difficult to know where to start. So I'm not quite sure what the moral is, but the moral is I eventually sat down, and once I got my head into the process for how I was going to achieve putting this stuff on HOPS, putting it on HOPS was actually very easy. So I guess the moral is, once you get your head into the process of making an SMS, which I always start off with a brainstorm of all the things I've got to include in this particular SMS document, and then try and fluff each one out into a paragraph, then there's no stopping me. Then I'm on the road, and it's just the case of getting over that hump to get the system in place or the process in place in order for me to achieve the output that I want to achieve. So I thought it was ironic, because that is often a blocker in the creation of SMSs, is just knowing where to start and how to structure it. And I found exactly the same thing when I had to do a new section of HOPS like this to put the documentation on, and I thought you'd all like to hear that story. So sorry if you are all asleep after hearing that, but I just thought it was worthwhile to say that working out what the structure is going to be is the first step to success. So you can find all that on HOPS now. Now, there were some further points to do with Workshop 12, to do with the drugs and alcohol policy that I was asked to look into either during the video or afterwards, so I have looked into them. You may have already read this in Top of the HOPS, the newsletter that came out a week or so ago, but I'll just go over them briefly now. So staff taking prescription medication caused a lot of discussion, which is great, about what's a sensible way to mitigate the risks while also being reasonably achievable in the context of a heritage railway. And it's not reasonably achievable to just say we'll go for the maximum solution, and it's not appropriate to just go for the minimum solution. You've got to find the middle balance that satisfactorily mitigates the risks and is reasonably practicable to achieve. So for prescription medication, this is what the consensus came up with through discussion with various attendees, is a three-step process. First of all, a paper form that staff who are going to the doctors or the pharmacist to receive medication can take with them, and they can ask the doctor for their advice. And I hoped to have the form to show you, but I don't quite get to the stage where I felt it was ready to go out and be shown to everybody yet. There's a few people looking at it for me and trying to find holes in it and things like that, and I'd rather show you something that's complete rather than something that's just in progress. But it's very simple. It's got name, date and address and things like that along the top, and then a list of 6 or 8 things that happen on a heritage railway, like walking on uneven surfaces, climbing onto rail vehicles from ground level, working in extreme temperatures, concentrating for lengthy periods of time, operating heavy machinery, those sorts of things. And it asks the doctor to tick or cross to say whether or not the medication that's being prescribed is compatible with doing this sort of work. And then you ask the doctor to stamp it, and then that member of staff brings it to the railway and says, this is what the doctor says. And by comparing the work that the person on the railway is going to do with the ticks and crosses that the doctor has put on the form, we can hopefully establish whether or not that medication is appropriate for the specific risks of the work the person is going to be doing. Now, I know that not all doctors will want to do that, and that's fair enough. That's why we've got step 2 and 3. We did it on a paper form to make sure that instead of it being verbal, the message couldn't get either misinterpreted or accidentally or on purpose miscommunicated to the railway. That it actually came from the doctor with a doctor's stamp on it, and we felt that that was sufficiently defendable as the railway having a reasonable look at what the medication is and having a reasonable go at getting some proper advice as to whether it's appropriate for the person to carry on working or not. Step 2, when the doctor's advice is unavailable, and this, in fact, step 1 and 2 are probably side by side, because step 2 can also be used when there's a very obvious yes or no answer, is the manager of the business unit discusses with the person what the medication is and reads the label and has a look at the work the person is going to do and makes a judgment. And in some cases that'll be really easy, and in some cases it'll be impossible, but this is the second step in this 3-step option of how to best manage staff taking prescription medication. So step 3, if you can't achieve either of the first 2, is medication checking service, and we did discuss this briefly on the workshop 6 weeks ago. Let's just move the screen up a little bit. There we go. We did discuss this briefly, and several people said, well, can you just look into it and find out how much it's going to cost? So I did exactly that, and we came up with a scheme where we I feel, successfully negotiated a good discount on what mainline operating companies pay with a proper official medically certified provider. The prices you can see on the screen, it's £25 a year to be in the scheme, but each medication check costs £14. That's per check, not per drug, but it is still quite expensive. So just to be very, very clear, I'm definitely not saying here this is a recommendation that you do and we feel all railways should be doing it. I'm putting this information out because several railways asked us to. There's the information. You can decide based on the risks of your undertaking as to whether it's appropriate to do this or not, whether it's appropriate to be in the scheme, and when or if it's appropriate to use it. So there's the information that you asked me for. The medication checking service can either be done by phone or online. Each railway will have its own PIN number to access the service and receive the results. HOPS does not get to see the results, so it's confidential in that respect. And unlike on the main line, where the PIN numbers are made fairly freely available and all staff are expected to phone up themselves and then just present the results to their manager in most cases, I would suggest that in a heritage railway, the PIN number is kept to perhaps the managers of the business units, and only when step 1 and 2 have been exhausted, the manager of the business unit rings up the medication checking service, and that will avoid any unnecessary costs from unnecessary checks that could have been resolved in step 1 or 2. So if you're interested in the medication checking service, please let me know, and depending on how many people, how many organisations want to join up to it, we will take it forward or we won't. Similarly, as well as the medication checking service, many of you asked about drugs and alcohol screening, so we did exactly the same with drugs and alcohol screening. This is also, well, this is more expensive, in fact. So again, just to be absolutely clear, I am not saying this is a recommendation that you should do. I'm saying you asked me for this information, so I went out and found it for you, and I think this is the best pricing option you're going to find. Certainly, if you find a cheaper one, let me know, because then I'll put that out to everybody else. So the drugs and alcohol scheme membership fee, £25 per year. If you call them out for a 4-cause screening, it costs £225, and they'll test up to 4 people. They obviously come out in a van with all the kit to drugs and alcohol screen up to 4 people. A random screening call out, which requires 2 days notice, is £215, and they'll test a lot more people, between 16 and 24 people. Depends on how long each person takes to produce the sample and so on. And then there is an additional laboratory fee to have the results analysed of £65. So it's quite an expensive game, but you asked me for the information, and so I have provided it. A few people did come up. In fact, Liz, I think, last time said that they had staff trained on site and instrumentation on site that was legally defendable, and that is another option. I haven't got any prices for that, I'm afraid, but it is another option to go down. It's totally up to you to mitigate the risks with your transport undertaking. Right, I think that's the end of my look back at workshop 12. Yes, it is. So let's move on to workshop 13 at long last. Only 29 minutes and 8 slides into the presentation. We'll actually start to do what we set out to do today. So the control of working hours and fatigue risk. This is what this workshop is all about. And just to start with a big headline, this is what it says in ROGS. This is what we're trying to comply with by having this part of our SMS. Every controller of safety critical work shall have in place arrangements to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that a safety critical worker under his management, supervision or control does not carry out safety critical work in circumstances where he is so fatigued or where he would be liable to become so fatigued that his health or safety or the health or safety of other persons on a transport system could be significantly affected. So, there's a lot of words in there that don't have very precise definitions. So first of all, at the very end, significantly affected. That's open to interpretation. The arrangements in place so far as reasonably practicable. That's open to interpretation. And fatigue is also open to interpretation. None of those things have mathematically achievable calculations to determine whether or not somebody is fatigued or unfatigued, or whether the safety of a person on a transport system is significantly or insignificantly affected. And you'll be unsurprised to learn, one of my favourite words, it's down to the risk assessment to determine what is risky enough to warrant some control measures in the case of each of our particular companies. And some of us certainly have a lot greater risk than others. Thank you very much to Liz in the comments, who says that anyone is welcome to contact her if they're interested in the in-house drugs and alcohol medication service that they have at the North Yorkshire Moors. So thank you very much, Liz. If anyone doesn't have Liz's information or can't get her through Facebook, then feel free to email into HOPS and I'll forward the email to Liz. Right, okay, so that's the headline out of ROGs. Everything else is down to our risk assessment to determine what's appropriate. So we'll now move over, as we do in these things, to our Word documents of the SMS. Whoops. And this is our what will become our SMS best practice template as a result of this workshop and the comments that you give me during and after it. So I will rearrange my screen once again. There we go. So first of all, the standard, as I'm sure you saw for the drugs and alcohol SMS, just in case anyone finds it in HOPS and gets confused about whether it's their own organisation's SMS or not, a big heading to make sure nobody is in any doubt about that. All that page is the same as it was in the drugs and alcohol SMS. A nice cover page for you, and just to confirm, where the text is shown in red, this is where I'm expecting you to put your own information in before you issue it. Or of course, you can completely chop it around, delete the cover page, do whatever you like to use this equivalent text. So we'll go through this step by step, the same as we did with the drugs and alcohol one, and we'll see what interesting discussions we can have about fatigue management. So the introduction, first of all, the company has a legal, which we just looked at, and a moral, of course, duty to protect the health and safety and well-being of its staff and passengers and visitors and all others with whom it interacts. Because if we're prepared to say that fatigue can have a negative effect on safety, then that negative effect could be to the member of staff themselves and their own well-being and health, or it could be to other people affected by the actions of that person, such as if the train was driven incorrectly or a signal box was worked incorrectly due to a person suffering from fatigue. The Health and Safety at Work Act also places legal responsibilities on staff coming to work to take reasonable care of their own and others' safety and to engage and cooperate with their company's policies and efforts to do so. And this is really important because there are a lot of things to do with the management of fatigue that it isn't reasonably practicable for the company to manage, especially in a heritage railway. And so the onus for those components falls on the individual. And that second paragraph underlines that the Health and Safety at Work Act obliges them to take part in that management process. If a person comes to work unfit for duty due to fatigue, it may impair their performance and can lead to them taking risks or putting others at risk. And understanding the signs, consequences, and our policy in addressing them helps us all to manage potential consequent risks to health and safety. This policy details how we will manage the risks arising from potential fatigue, and this is the means by which the company complies with its responsibilities in Regulation 25.1 of ROGs, which is what was on the slide. And I always think it's helpful at the top of an SMS document to be very clear about what legislation or problem or issue this SMS document is trying to solve. It leaves no opportunity for anybody to say, you did not have a policy in place detailing how you will manage your responsibilities under regulation blah blah of whatever legislation. Okay, there in section 2 is a copy of what was in the slides that we just looked at. So into some of the more meaty stuff. There is no single agreed definition of fatigue, but for the purpose of this document, fatigue will be considered as a state of perceived weariness that can result from prolonged working, heavy workload, insufficient rest, and inadequate sleep. It involves a general feeling of tiredness resulting in a reduced ability to perform work effectively, which would contravene that regulation that we just looked at. A fatigued person will be less alert, less able to process information, and will take longer to react and make decisions, and will have less interest in working compared to a person who is not fatigued. Fatigue increases the likelihood of errors and adversely affects performance, especially in tasks requiring vigilance and monitoring, decision-making, awareness, fast reaction time, tracking ability, and memory. Well, obviously, please feel free to let me know if you disagree with any of that, but hopefully that's a fairly straightforward introduction. Fatigued staff may not adequately perceive risk and may tolerate risks that they would usually find unacceptable, accepting lower standards of performance and safety. Staff communication, monitoring, and coordination activities are adversely affected by fatigue. The identification of risk is really important. We certainly are more likely to mitigate risk as individuals if we identify that risk as we come up to it. Case in point, which is often used, crossing the road. We're all aware of the risks of crossing the road, that you might get run over by a car, so we apply mitigation. We look both ways. But a child is not so aware of the risks of crossing the road, so doesn't think to apply that mitigation. And although that's a really simple example, there are loads of really detailed, complex examples in the application of a railway, and fatigue reduces our ability to perceive those risks, and everything else just dominoes out after that. People can often be completely unaware of the extent to which their performance is being reduced by fatigue and may be unaware of lapses in attention or even briefly nodding off. Certainly railway incidents, certainly on the main line, have been caused by staff taking micro sleep, nodding off without even realising it. Fatigue can be hard to detect in staff. Unlike other causes of temporary mental impairment such as drugs and alcohol, there is no blood test for fatigue. Fatigue and the speed of its onset can be affected by a number of factors, including the shift length, time of shift, such as in the early morning or late at night, the rest period available before the shift, the location and quality of sleep, the distance travelled to work, particularly in the case of a heritage railway, weather and environmental conditions, the nature of work, interaction with others, and engagement. So what will we do? Here is what we will do. And just to remind you all, I always refer to company in the SMS, just so that the template can apply to any trust, charity, CIC, limited, organisation. You're welcome to go through and change every instance of the word company to your own company name if you want, but I think you're making a bit of a rod for your own back. So Tom Bailey has said, I know the response would be, we don't need that, they don't enforce us, and I'm starting on the back foot. Is this with regards to ROGs, Tom, because your railway isn't governed by ROGs? So it'll take a while before you hear that in order to answer it, but I'll just answer that in case that is what you are referring to. So yes, there will be railways out there who aren't covered by ROGs, but they are still covered by the Health and Safety at Work Act, for example. There's still the regulatory authority is still the HSE, and even though you don't necessarily have to title up your documents, this is what it says in ROGs, in the huge majority of circumstances, you'll be able to get exactly the same answers out of the Health and Safety at Work Act or other legislation applicable to the organisation that you're running. So yes, if you are a miniature railway, as Tom is, then ROGs won't apply, but the Health and Safety at Work Act still will. Now, you may find that the nature of a miniature railway is such that some risks aren't as significant as they are on a standard gauge railway or even a 2-foot gauge railway or a broad gauge railway. And it's up to you to make sure that what you take out of the template matches the risks that you've actually got. It would also apply completely at the other end of the scale. I've made this SMS template based on my experience in heritage railways and what you've told me. Most heritage railways don't take their trains out onto the main line, but some of them do. So if you are a heritage railway that takes your train out onto the main line, the chances are you're going to need to go the other way, to the way that Tom is going to need to go, and probably put extra stuff in for extra risks that generally heritage railways that stay on their own controlled infrastructure don't have. I'm never ever going to say that one template will fit all, but this is about making a template that we can all use and pick the bits we want out of, and I hope that in the majority of cases, the majority of it will be appropriate. So yes, to a certain extent then, Tom, they are right. They don't enforce you, ROGS doesn't enforce you, but the Health and Safety at Work Act still does, the HSE still does, and the majority of the risks that you're going to be mitigating are the same, even if to a lesser extent. So here's what the company will do. The company will manage fatigue by the following. Rosters, diagrams, and plans for working arrangements will comply with the rules on maximum shift lengths and minimum rest periods contained in this policy. A huge thing that we can all do to manage fatigue is the management of maximum shift length and minimum rest period. Staff must not sign on for duty if they are unfit due to fatigue, and the declaration at signing on point states this. Remember, the staff have an obligation under the Health and Safety at Work Act, as well as us as duty holders, to engage with this policy. And there are many things, obviously, that a member of staff could do to be fatigued, and it's up to them to declare that or not sign on if they are feeling fatigued. If a member of staff becomes fatigued during the course of their duty, or it becomes apparent the duty will exceed the maximum length, the function supervisor must be advised, that's the duty manager or the duty officer or whoever it is, and the individual must not exceed the maximum length without authority. And later on in this document, we'll have a look at what the process for obtaining that authority is. So Liz has made a comment about working time regulations specifying 11 hours without an opt-out, giving you travelling time of 1 hour each way to work, and performance dips drastically after 11 hours. Yes, so there is a lot of research material out there that shows how performance drops off after the amount of time people have been working. And later on in this document, we'll talk about travelling time, and the 1 hour that you mentioned there, Liz, is exactly what I've put in this document. Although, of course, it is slightly awkward to manage in a heritage context where quite often people will stay on site and not at their home between turns and things like that. But an hour each way is exactly what we've settled on. Alistair says try 5 gauges. Who covers what? Well, anything that's above, is it 350 millimeters? I can't remember, but if you type in who does ROGS apply to into Google, you'll pretty quickly find that the main criteria for where ROGS applies and where it doesn't is an overlap of gauge. But again, even for the parts of your multi-gauged organisation that it doesn't, the Health and Safety at Work Act will still apply, and most of this will be supported by the Health and Safety at Work Act. Fourth bullet point, function supervisors will be alert for signs of fatigue during each day's operation, particularly during times of intense working and long days. Signs of fatigue may include tiredness, making errors, becoming irritable, lack of concentration, and out of character behaviour. So just because we've met the mathematical requirements of minimum rest and maximum turn length does not mean we are completely immune from fatigue, and the function supervisors, the people who are there on the day, it must be part of their responsibility to be alert for signs of fatigue. So just before we talk about maximum hours and what you can see on the screen below, we're just going to break off from the policy slightly, and we're going to have a brief look at a document that you may have seen before. Let me try and get it so that it fits on the page. Here we are. Whoops. Sorry, of course, because it didn't work, my camera system didn't work properly at the start. All my screens have gone a bit squiffy. Here we are. So this is the front page of the investigation into the Clapham Railway accident, which happened in 1988. There's a photograph of it. And the report was conducted by Anthony Hidden. And one of the many contributory factors, because there's always many contributory factors that lead to a railway accident, was to do with the working time of staff involved in working on the signalling equipment. And some staff have been working much, much more than we would now consider appropriate, and had had far less rest than we would now consider the minimum. The reason I'm showing you this is to show that this didn't just come out of thin air. It has been born out of a specific railway accident, and there have been many other railway accidents, both before and after, where fatigue has been a contributory factor. But one point to clear up is the recommendations that came out of the Clapham accident, often referred to as the Hidden 18, because they were Anthony Hidden's 18 recommendations, are just that. They are recommendations, and there aren't many places where some of the things that we have to dream up about how we're going to manage safety are enshrined in law in actual numbers. Remember when we looked at that paragraph out of ROGS, it just said must not be fatigued. It didn't give any numbers or any way of measuring it. It's all up to us based on the risk to make sure that our management of fatigue does not allow somebody to become excessively fatigued for our organisation. So on one hand, I'm going to say they're only recommendations. They're up to you to risk assess. But on the other hand, I'm going to say they are extremely widely employed throughout the railway industry. And I think you would have to have a fairly strong case for deviating from them in terms of making shifts longer or making rest less. Obviously, you can apply more restrictive measurements as you wish, as your risk assessment determines. You can download the investigation into the Clapham accident for free off the internet, and although it's 250 pages long and you might not want to read the whole thing, certainly reading the bits about how the HIDN 18 recommendations came about might be interesting. So let's move on then to how we're going to apply an appropriate interpretation of the HIDN 18 recommendations to our context as a heritage railway. So first of all, the maximum hours of a shift. The maximum hours of any planned shift shall be 12 hours. I would say you'd be extremely brave to allow a planned shift to be beyond 12 hours. If you want to make it less, then that's absolutely fine. More than 12 hours in a single shift may only be worked by exception and must be authorised on each occasion by the function supervisor, who will carry out the necessary risk assessment below and record this, because occasionally in an emergency it might be necessary. If a train breaks down, if a relief fails to turn up, things like that. It may well be, based on the balance of risk, that the least risky thing is to exceed 12 hours. If there's a train full of passengers out in the middle of the line somewhere with a broken down engine on it, and your options are that the driver and fireman stay on for another hour to bring the train home, or you leave the train where it is with all the passengers on overnight and then come back in the morning, clearly the least worst option is going to be to let the crew exceed their 12 hours. But that doesn't mean we can do it willy-nilly. We will have to carry out a risk assessment process to be able to demonstrate that we established that was the least worst option. Thank you very much to Richard, who's confirmed that ROGS applies to gauges of 350 millimetres and above. There are loads of other, there's about a whole page of other ins and outs of where ROGS does and doesn't apply, but certainly the gauge is by far the most significant metric. So the maximum planned length of a shift should be 12 hours. We shall never plan to go more than 12, but more than 12 may be worked by exception and must be authorised by the function supervisor. The number of hours worked in any 7-day rolling period shall not exceed 72. That's 6 12-hour shifts. That's a pretty big number to be working on a heritage railway, but that is the maximum that's applied pretty universally elsewhere. And again, if you want to put a smaller number on it, that's absolutely fine, but I wouldn't recommend a bigger number. For rostered staff, HOPS roster validation highlights where the maximum turn length is exceeded. So let's see if I can get that on the screen. Let's bring HOPS over here. There it is. Here's a roster in HOPS on the validation tab, and here is the, it's this tab actually, sorry. Here is the shift length tab, which lists out turns with excessive length. So there's one on here on the 4th of April. This person, Danny Adamson, is working from 0700 to 2300. The maximum allowed is 12 and the actual length is 16 hours. That's on the 4th of April. Let's just go and have a look. 4th of April, there it is, 07 to 23. The roster validation system also advises us when there are turns without times, because if there's a turn without a time, then it can't be tested for excessive turn length. So all of those turns don't have times at all, so we can't test them to check that they don't have an excessive length. But the ORR's document on managing rail fatigue, which I will now open, and hopefully it will show on the screen. Here we are. Says, oh, let's have a look. Oh, it's searching very slowly. Here we are, look at this. So, more advanced work scheduling software packages can be programmed in a tailored way to flag up deviations from specified conditions, e.g. attention, less than 12 hours between duties. So look at that, an advanced software scheduling package. Thank you very much, ORR. HOPS, of course, also has the tab for minimum rest and where the minimum rest has not been obtained, which we'll come on to in a second. So 12 hours max, 72 in a week. We have a system in place for managing that. And so much of this is not about just saying we will do this, we will do that. It's how are we going to achieve it? How are we going to manage it? The safety management system shows how we're going to manage these things. So a good mechanism for managing it is that the roster validation in the rostering system that we use highlights if a turn exceeds the maximum length. We can demonstrate that we're managing it. Whoops, too far. Minimum rest between shifts. The minimum rest before safety critical turns shall be 12 hours. Cut and lift out of HIDN 18. The rest period for safety critical work may be reduced only by exception and when authorised on each occasion by the function supervisor who will carry out the necessary risk assessment, same as above. For rostered staff, HOPS roster validation highlights where the minimum rest period is insufficient. So again, this is what we're going to do, and this is the mechanism by which we're going to achieve it. The working time directive, Liz has pointed out, is 48 hours per week without opt-out. Yes, and I imagine that applies, in fact, it definitely applies differently to employed staff to volunteer staff. But the working time directive is a thing that, but it is possible for employees certainly to opt out of the 48 hours of the working time directive. I haven't included that in here, I must admit. Maybe that's something that I should have done. But we'll see in the comments that we get during this video and after whether we think that's something that we need to include. The minimum rest period before non-safety critical turns does not have such a significant impact on safety assurance, but is still important to manage for staff welfare and service quality. The sufficient minimum rest period will vary hugely based on the ability of the staff member concerned and should be managed locally and amicably on a case-by-case basis, considering how demanding the task is and the fitness of the person concerned. And there is, of course, a huge range of fitnesses, and I'm choosing my words very carefully here, a huge range of fitnesses of staff who work on heritage railways. And for some of them, it will be completely appropriate to be the wine waiter on the dining train until 11 o'clock at night, and then be back in at 8 o'clock in the morning serving breakfast. Non-safety critical and may be completely appropriate. Whereas in other cases, of course, the driver of that dining train, driving the train until 11 o'clock at night, not appropriate for them to come back with less than the minimum rest. So Tom Bailey has pointed out that the working time directive apparently cannot be opted out if the worker, volunteer or otherwise, is a night worker. It'd be very interesting to learn what the definition of a night worker is and how much a proportion of your work has to be done at night in order for you to be considered a night worker. Because we certainly have shifts on heritage railways that go on, until midnight, but they're by far in the minority. Also, I certainly know on the main line where staff work 24/7 that the working time the opt-out of the working time directive is available to them. So, but of course they're not permanently on nights; they're days and nights and early and late turns and things. So that's going to require a bit of looking into. And Thomas just pointed out, can we have a section in the template for the working time directive? So it sounds like that is something that we do need. I'll have to do a bit of research because genuinely, if it is the case that you can't opt out if the person is a night worker, we need to understand what a night worker, what the definition of a night worker is. And I don't know that, and I'm certainly not going to try and bluff my way through. So just to go back and recap, minimum rest, 12 hours for safety critical, and whatever you feel is appropriate for how demanding the task is and how fit the person is for non-safety critical. Okay, right, moving on a bit. Rest periods within the shift. Rostered staff, shift diagrams should take rest breaks into consideration. So if you're a loco driver or if you're responsible for controlling the safety critical work of a loco driver, then it should be written in fairly black and white when during the timetable that person is going to take their break. If they take the 10 o'clock train from here to there and then the 11 o'clock train from there to there, at what point are you saying is their official break? And that should be something that's written in black and white so everyone knows when it is. For on-train rolls, it is expected that a defined break period will be provided, as I just said. This may be a break in the timetable, where the crew remain responsible for the train or locomotive or buffet when it is stationary at a station, or by being relieved by another crew. So certainly in the case of steam engines where there's two on the footplate, personally, I would say it's reasonable to say you have your break when you get to this station, you're still responsible for the loco at the time. Obviously it's parked up. Don't leave it unattended, go to the toilet in turns. Whereas in other cases, you might determine that the risk is such that they need to be relieved by another crew to look after the engine while they're having their break. Of course, if you've got a very long day, you might have an AM crew and a PM crew, and they can overlap a bit in the middle and give breaks and things like that, and that works quite well. Ernest from the South Devon Railway Operations and Safety Director has said that he thinks that there are exceptions for certain workers, including transport workers, re the night worker opt-out. Well, I don't know, I must admit, and you've certainly caught me off guard here with this working time directive comments. We would also have to establish whether or not people who work on heritage railways are transport workers, or whether they're just considered to be hospitality, tourism workers in that respect. Oh my goodness, Tom has found the definition. Right, Tom, I can't read that whole thing out loud. 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. seems to be the crux of it. So I would definitely say, without reading all of this, that in general, people who work on heritage railways would not be considered night workers, even though some of their shifts might go beyond 11 p.m. or start beyond 6 a.m. Unless, I guess, you employ a permanent overnight fire warmer or something like that. Okay, I'm going to take some homework to look into this, and thank you very much for raising it, because that's exactly what the purpose of these workshops is that you raise stuff and it goes into the template. So thank you very much. Right, so rest periods within a shift for rostered staff. There should be some written down template of when they're expected to have their break to make sure that they do actually get it. For non-rostered staff, workshop, maintenance, civils, grounds, office, etc., and other non-rostered staff must arrange to take breaks at a suitable point in the day and at such intervals as to avoid fatigue or other work-related stresses. In some departments, such as retail or catering, the local manager must arrange the times at which suitable breaks will be taken by each member of staff to ensure continuity of service. Well, it goes without saying, really, but in other roles, such as office or clerical, staff will manage their break times themselves. I'm not going to labour on and on about non-rostered staff because it doesn't have such a great... sorry, I was going to say the wrong thing there. I'm not going to labour on and on about non-safety critical staff because they don't have such an impact on safety, but we do have a duty of care to the welfare of our employees, and so we should make reasonable provision for breaks based on the risk and based on how demanding the task is. Right, okay, so I think we've got there through all that lot. Rest breaks within shifts. Let's move on to the slightly controversial topic of travelling time. So, particular things to look out for here is a lot of people travel a long way in order to volunteer on their favourite railway, and a lot of people stay on site and don't actually go home to their home location afterwards. So it's extremely difficult to apply a system that's going to automatically manage this. And in fact, it's difficult enough that I haven't come up with one. So we're going to look at what I've worked through as a solution, but the onus is going to be very much on the individuals to manage it. So Phil has pointed out, we're still on this night worker thing, that for HGV workers, night turn is 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., but it seems like it varies between industries. Yes. And in a minute, when we're going to talk about the duty of cooperation between different duty holders on which the same person works, we're going to find out that you're going to have to apply some boundaries around ROGs and just say we can't cope with everything. So I think I'm going to deliberately sort of close my eyes and not think about other industries when it's complicated enough just to think about the railway industry. We get completely tied up in knots if we start comparing it to other industries. So, travelling time. Staff must be mindful that travelling to and from work, especially when driving, contributes to cumulative fatigue. When driving to or from work, travelling time up to an hour in each direction is considered acceptable without further calculation. Okay, so whatever time you put on the maximum length of shift, a person is allowed 1 hour travelling either side. This means that on a rostered 12-hour turnaround between shifts, the member of staff is at home or their place of rest for a minimum of 10 hours, which gives sufficient time for a meal and adequate sleep or rest. So if they are doing a 12-hour shift, the maximum possible, then they travel an hour home, and then in the worst case scenario, they're going to get up again in the morning and travel an hour back to the railway. They have at least got 10 hours at home. Through discussion with a lot of you, that was seemed to be the maximum we were prepared to push it to, which I think is reasonable, and I certainly know is applied with various levels of formality in the mainline arena as well. Adam has pointed out 14 hours door to door. Yep, that's exactly what that is. 12 plus 1 plus 1, 14 hours door to door. But any travelling time over an hour in each direction is considered to contribute to fatigue sufficiently for it to be counted as part of the shift length. and therefore the time actually on duty at the railway reduced in sympathy, so that the shift length plus the travelling time over an hour in each direction is a maximum of 12 hours. So I know we're starting to get a little bit complicated, but we do have to be seen to be addressing the risk that, to be honest, I can think of in my friends, people who live 3 hours away from their railway, and perhaps in the past, before we were as mature as we are now as a team with our SMSs, might have been a little bit guilty of travelling 3 hours to the railway and then doing their shift. So in this policy, the countable travelling time is any time spent travelling to or from work over an hour in each direction. And just to be clear, that's considered separately in each direction. So you can't travel 3 hours to work, then do your 12-hour shift and then stay on site and say, oh, well, that's the maximum 12 hours travelling time. No. It's anything up to an hour travelling to work, anything up to an hour travelling from work. And that's because, of course, you're building up fatigue before you even arrive at work on your way to work, which is then going to knock on to how refreshed you are for your shift. You could say, in a parallel universe, that once somebody is driving home, they're not going to affect the safety of the railway anymore, so do we really need to include it? Well, yes, we do, because we still have a duty of care to make sure that we don't put someone in a position where they're going to be fatigued, because it's bad for their health, not least of all because they might crash their car on the way home and kill themselves or somebody else. So it's an unwise idea to try and discount time spent travelling from the railway back to home. Although, of course, it is unmanageable or unenforceable, let's say, we can only rely on individuals to be briefed in this as part of their induction and follow it. Adam says driving 2 hours each way equals maximum 8-hour shift. No, that's not quite the maths that I meant. Driving 2 hours each way equals maximum 10-hour shift on the railway, because it's an hour over an hour on the way there and an hour over an hour on the way back, which means you take 2 hours off your maximum 12 and you're left with 10. That was my intention. It's not once you go over an hour, everything counts. So where are we? So, as often staff, I'm here by the way on this paragraph. As staff often travel to and from places other than their home before or after a shift, the onus is placed on the individual member of staff to raise the matter to their roster clerk or head of department, or if at short notice, the function supervisor, if their travelling time is more than an hour and the sum of the additional travelling time, the countable travelling time, that should probably say, and their shift lengths exceed 12 hours. Now, in many cases, and I would say the majority of cases, roster clerks are good roster clerks because they know their staff and they know where they can twist people's arm to cover a turn or say, well, he likes working on Tuesday, so maybe if I get him to swap for a Wednesday, he'll do a Tuesday, all that stuff. And I hope, and I think it probably is the case, that generally roster clerks know where their staff live as well. And so a good roster clerk will take this into consideration when doing the roster in the first place. But the onus can only really be left on the individual person to raise it if they were planning to drive for 5 hours from Manchester to Minehead and then book on and do a 12-hour shift. The onus is on them to ring up and say, look, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be driving to Minehead that morning, so I can't do a shift that's that long. For example, I don't know why I needed to make that Minehead example up. I've got some examples here. Chris lives 1.5 hours from the railway. His shift length at work is 10 hours. Therefore, half an hour in each direction must be added to the shift length, as the journey is half an hour more than 1 hour. 10 plus a half is 11, so the time is within 12-hour maximum. John lives 2.5 hours away from the railway. His shift length at work is 10 hours. From each of his journeys, an hour and a half must be added to the shift length, as the journey is an hour and a half more than 1 hour. So that's 10 plus 1.5 plus 1.5 is 13. So the time is not within the 12-hour maximum, and John needs to raise this with his roster clerk, head of department, or function supervisor. The turn must not be worked with these travel times unless the manager of the business unit gives permission on each specific occasion using the risk assessment process below. Now, you might have spotted that earlier on I said function supervisor, and now I've said manager of the business unit. So my distinction is that if it's an emergency, the function supervisor, which is defined as the manager that's on duty, will make the assessment, do the risk assessment, as we'll see in a moment, and then determine whether to allow the person to continue working or not. And of course, it's got to be the least worst option to allow them to continue working. Whereas if it's going to be planned, then the manager of the business unit has to make that decision. And the reason why I'm now saying, oh, it might be planned, is if we could not cover a turn next Tuesday, 7 days from today, and no matter what we do, we can't cover it. We're going to have to cancel the 11 o'clock. But don't worry, because there's a 10 o'clock and a 12 o'clock. And so the passengers who were going to get on the 11 o'clock will have to either go on the 10 o'clock or the 12 o'clock. That's not unreasonable, so we should cancel the 11 o'clock. In another example, let's imagine that I can't cover a turn in 4 days' time, and it's the only train running that day, and it's somebody getting married, and then it's their wedding reception on the train. And they've paid a lot of money for it, and there would be a lot greater impact on the risk assessment if we were to cancel that train. And it is perfectly reasonable to consider PR impact and financial impact, as well as safety impact, in a risk assessment. So we might say, well, how far over hours would the driver have to go in order for us to run that train? Oh, only 15 minutes. Right, well, in that case, as the manager of the business unit, I'm prepared to say that we will authorise him to go over 12 hours by 15 minutes because that's the less worse option than cancelling somebody's wedding reception with all the associated costs and PR and everything else that comes with that. You are allowed to balance these things. Now, that's not to say that if that means a person has to do a 20-hour shift, that you can justify it on that basis, because you can't. Only you can make that balance. Only you can make that risk assessment, and then you have to live and die by it. But I think it would be foolish of us to have an SMS that says we will never, ever, ever, ever go above the maximum. We will only ever, 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 ever do 12. When in reality there are probably going to be occasions where it is both appropriate in an emergency and sometimes even as a planned thing, if we can demonstrate it's the least worst option, to authorise somebody to go beyond 12. On my screen the video keeps flashing in and out, so I don't know whether you can see that as well, and if you can I apologise. But on my screen the video keeps flashing back to the flow chart that we looked at right at the beginning and then coming back again. So last bullet point, however, so we're still talking about John, who's going to drive 2.5 hours from the railway. However, if John arranges to stay overnight close to the railway after his shift, then his going home time is reduced to less than an hour. So let's imagine he's staying on site and he's going to have 0 minutes in order to get to his place of rest. The new calculation is then 10 plus 1.5, which is the time above an hour for his drive to work, plus 0, which is 11.5, which brings the overall time within the 12-hour maximum. Again, it's very difficult to plan on behalf of staff whether they're going to stay on site 2 miles away with their auntie or they're going to drive all the way home. And that's why, because that's not reasonably practicable, we can put the onus on the individual to raise it if the roster happens to have them working in such a way that they would exceed this 12-hour maximum. So here's a controversial thing: staff travelling to or from work as passengers in cars or taxis or public transport. What should we do about those? Well, they're not in bed, so they're not asleep, or they might well be asleep on the train, but being asleep on the train or in a car is not good quality sleep that you get in a bed, particularly your own bed. So here is what we've come up with as the best practice. Staff in these conditions are not subject to the same cumulative fatigue as those driving, but are still deprived of the comfort and rest of sleep they would otherwise feel in a bed. This can contribute negatively to the person's fatigue and general health. Therefore, this time travelling does also count as travelling time when managing fatigue in accordance with this policy. But before you all, or before everyone loses their mind over this, don't forget that if we consider that the time that you spend as a passenger in a car or a taxi on public transport counts towards your shift length, and then somebody says, John, for example, comes along and says, oh, that means I'm now above the shift length, the manager of the business unit can look at the circumstances and how far above the shift length it is and what sort of rest the person is getting when they are at their place of rest, and whether they're staying on site or going home after it, and whether they're a passenger in a train or in a car or in a taxi, all those sorts of things, can do the risk assessment and then can either authorise it or not. Like I said a minute ago, I think it would be very silly to say we will never, ever, ever do this. The policy is about identifying when we've gone over that 12 and the manager of the business unit needs to have a look and either give permission or not in the circumstances. Far rather that to have a false positive than to say that travelling time as a passenger does not count and then miss a real positive. It's particularly important when travelling to the railway, because obviously you're travelling to the railway, then you're going to do your safety critical work. This isn't actually as important when you go home from the railway, because you're not likely to kill anyone if you fall asleep on the train, unlike if you fall asleep in your car. But that does start to get into a very messy mixture of grey areas as to what counts and what doesn't. And ultimately, we shouldn't be putting anyone in a position where they are going to become fatigued, because it is bad for their health. So that's what I came up with, or we came up with, and thank you very much to everyone that fed into this, that time spent travelling as a passenger would be included. That would produce a positive, and then it would be up to us to risk assess to see whether or not we needed to enforce that or to allow it to happen. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. I'm sure you'll have lots of comments about whether it should be 1 hour, 2 hours, time on the end, time on the beginning, all the different bits and bobs. And please do send them in either in the comments or by an email afterwards. If you've got a system where you think it's managed better than this, then do send it to me and I'll see what I can compare and see what I think needs to come out of this template and be replaced with what you've got, etc., etc., etc. That's what this is all about. But hopefully that is a fairly good approximation. Okay, right, maximum number of days worked. The maximum number of consecutive days worked of any turn length shall be 13. It's unlikely, I think, on a heritage railway that most people are going to get to 13 turns in a row, especially if they're long turns. But in a minute, in fact, if I go down another line, you'll be able to see that we're going to talk about staff working for other railways or carrying out other fatiguing work. And that maximum consecutive days worked, and we should clarify that's safety critical, the maximum number of days worked of any turn length on safety critical duties shall be 13. It's going to become relevant when we start looking at the fact that many volunteers also work on the main line, many people work for more than one heritage railway, and there is no getting away from the fact that we have to manage that, and it is reasonably practicable to do so. So the maximum number of consecutive days work shall be 13, and that number comes out of hidden as well. Right, staff working for other railways or carrying out other fatiguing work. This is also quite a controversial subject. It did come up in the last workshop where we talked about drugs and alcohol screening, and if somebody has an incident on the main line or an incident on a heritage railway, should we be telling each other, etc., etc. Well, without wishing to get bogged down in that argument this week, at least, I'm sure we might tackle it in the future. We do need to think about if somebody, particularly on the main line, is doing the maximum number of shifts they're allowed to do on the main line and then coming to work on a heritage railway doing safety critical work. And there is one school of thought that says, well, if the work that the person is doing on the main line is very different to the work that they're doing on a heritage railway, let's imagine they're a trained driver on the main line and they're a signalman on the heritage railway, or even if they're both signalmen, if they're a signalman in a VDU signalling centre on the main line and then they come and work a mechanical box and it's got a stove and they're having a Sunday lunch and there's only one train an hour, and all these excuses as to why working in different safety critical environments should or shouldn't be included, I'm afraid to say none of them really stand up. Now, having said that none of them stand up, you might be tempted to say, or somebody might be tempted to say to you, well, so you're saying then, Danny, that I can't do my completely different mainline job and then come and work on a heritage railway, but I could go and run a marathon or look after my 10 children for the day or operate other heavy machinery and all that stuff and then come and work on the heritage railway. And my answer would be, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. As long as, in those circumstances, you're prepared to say that you're not fatigued, then you can come and work on the heritage railway, because that's not what it says in ROGS. And the reason we're doing this, remember, right at the beginning, was to manage health and safety, was to meet that Regulation 25.1 of ROGS about safety critical work on transport undertakings. And I don't think, after much discussion, we can come up with a convincing argument as to why working for a different transport undertaking should not count towards the figures in the management of fatigue. And where I think this really came home is there are some companies, no, sorry, let me start at the beginning. If we were prepared to say that it didn't count, and so somebody could work on railway A and then come along and work on railway B without the sufficient rest in between, or whatever it is, if we were prepared to say that that was allowed, then what would we then say if both of those railway companies were owned by the same company, and it was actually the same railway company but two completely different railways? And it didn't used to be, but now one has bought the other and they're now the same company. Now we go, oh, well, now they're working for the same employer, maybe even for the same manager. Is that still appropriate? And you go, oh, no, definitely not if it's in the same company. Well, what was really the difference to the management of fatigue? What was really the difference to safety when someone was working on two different heritage railways, or the heritage railway and the main line, for different companies and different employers, or those railways being owned and operated by the same company and the same manager? And there's no, well, as far as I can see anyway, there's no justification for that. And therefore, the only sensible solution is that all railway work, and that's railways that are governed by ROGs, because that's what we're trying to comply with here, counts. And anything else, the onus is on the individual to state if they're fatigued or make sure that they turn up for work when they're not fatigued. More than happy to discuss that in more detail. I think I've discussed that for about, I don't know, a lot of hours over the last 6 weeks with various different contributors to the SMS workshop. So thank you very much for all of the input that you've had. And for those of you that argued one way or argued the other, that is the best that I can come up with. That all work on railways that come under ROGs counts, everything else doesn't. We can't include everything else, otherwise we'd have to include literally everything, from doing the dishes to driving cars and all sorts of stuff. So ROGs is the boundary that I've set, and that's where we're going. Right, for some reason here we go. So staff working on other railways. It is recognised that each person copes differently with fatigue and with different ability, because different people are able to cope with fatigue differently. While the onus remains on the individual to ensure that they do not feel fatigued when signing on for duty, the company also has an obligation to provide some rules and limits to work to, if nothing else, in order to maintain its position to defend itself. Maybe I should reword that too, in order to be able to demonstrate that it's doing everything reasonably practicable to manage the situation. As a general rule, work undertaken on any railway counts towards work undertaken on all railways. In determining whether two turns are compatible with each other, which might be on different railways, it should be considered as if the two turns were on the same railway, because that makes it a lot easier to come up with a judgment. If you're trying to decide whether or not somebody who did this particular turn for another company yesterday should be allowed to do this turn today or tomorrow, whatever it is, consider if they were on the same company, would we allow it? If the answer is no, it's probably not a good idea. If the answer is yes, then it may be a good idea. Therefore, the maximum and minimum values in this policy include shifts that a member of staff has done working for other railway duty holders, including in volunteer and employed capacity, and including mainline and heritage railways, but extends only as far as railways operating under ROGs legislation. And as Tom might be pleased to see, this is to deliberately exclude, for example, miniature railways. And I know that you can get fatigued working on a miniature railway, but you've got to draw the line somewhere. So let's draw it at ROGs, because that's the least worst place to draw the line. In the absence of a reasonably practicable automated process for managing this, because we don't all have access to each other's data, the onus is on the individual to ensure that their working times comply with this policy, considering all work they undertake for other railways. And staff should discuss with their head of department if they are unsure whether another railway on which they are working is operating under ROGs and counts towards this or not. Okay, so you've all gone very quiet in the comments, so I hope you are still there. But if you've got anything that you particularly disagree with in everything I've just said, then please feel free to argue with me in the comments. I've done my best based on the discussions that we've had, but I hope you cannot go, Tom, but I hope that you will see the logic behind it. But more than happy to discuss it, more than happy to have my mind changed. Please change it if you think that I've gone down the wrong avenue. It is also recognised that staff may take part in other fatiguing activities, such as physical exercise or operating other machinery. This time does not count for the specific working time calculations given in this policy. as the boundaries of ROGs are considered appropriate for the boundaries for what to include. An onus remains on the individual to identify if they are fatigued from other non-railway activities and ensure they are not fatigued when signing on for railway work. Richard has pointed out that ROGs is a regulation, not legislation. Okay, thank you very much. Finally, the company will cooperate with other duty holders if requested to share information about staff working time as required by Regulation 26.2 of ROGs. That's not the regulation that we looked at a minute ago. That is one that says all duty holders must cooperate with each other to assist in the management of fatigue. And I think that's a really important paragraph to put here in this policy, because you may have already spotted that there is a little bit of a conflict with GDPR in that paragraph, because that is information that's held about an individual, which we shouldn't share without having one of the many lawful bases in GDPR. One of the lawful bases is to comply with the law, and that's what we're doing here. But it helps to have that here in the policy so that nobody can argue or nobody can say they weren't aware that if in extremis you wanted to establish whether a particular member of staff had done other turns for another duty holder and whether they were safety critical or not, or whatever, that there is an obligation on all of us in ROGs to cooperate with each other in that respect. Doesn't give a definition of what cooperate is, but I would suggest it's telling the other duty holder what turns that particular person has done. I'm not suggesting it's something we would do routinely, but I think it is something that we should all bear in mind that we can do, and if somebody else asked us, then we should cooperate if somebody else is doing it in the best interest of managing fatigue. Okay, happy with that one. So let's now look at how we deviate from this, because I've said several times, oh, we'll deviate if we do the risk assessment and all that stuff. So this is the proper process that we're going to go through if we need to deviate from all that stuff above. So planned deviations. Shifts must never be planned to exceed the maximum length or for rest periods to be less than the minimum length, unless authorised by the manager of the business unit following the risk assessment process below, and to no more than 13 hours. We decided that was the absolute maximum, no matter how important anything else is. If you're planning to exceed the maximums given in your fatigue policy, and if your maximum is 12, 13 is the absolute floor. So no more than 13 hours, including the countable travelling time, unless the person does not have a shift the following day, and they will be travelling home as a passenger rather than driving themselves, in which case the travelling home time does not count. So remember I mentioned earlier, there's not as much risk if you're going home as a passenger on a train or in a taxi. This is an opportunity that in the extreme case where you are absolutely stuck and you're going to have to authorise somebody to do more than 12 hours, that as long as they don't have a turn the next day, which they're going to be coming back fatigued for, you can exclude their travelling home time if they're travelling as a passenger in order to get it within the maximum number allowed. No more than 14 shifts in a row, so it's one additional hour, one additional shift. No more than 1 hour less than the minimum rest period. No more than 1 hour less, it's not worded very well, I'm sorry, than the minimum rest period. So you can go down to 11 if the circumstances are extreme. If the required shift still cannot be covered within the above extended arrangements, then the work or trains will be cancelled. So we won't plan to go more than that, because we feel that that's the absolute maximum, but you can fill it in however you like. So that's planned. Oh, one more thing on planned. These planned exceptions must be authorised on each occasion by the manager of the business unit following the risk assessment below on each occasion. We'll get to the risk assessment in a second after we've looked at 10.2, emergency deviations. So this is where it wasn't planned, you didn't think it was going to be necessary, but it's become apparent that it's going to be necessary because the train has broken down or everything's running late or whatever it is. So in exceptional circumstances, a shift length may be increased in real time only if necessary in order to complete a task which must be completed, i.e. the operation of a train to destination, and for which it would otherwise be impossible to make other arrangements. A rest period may be reduced by 1 hour from the minimum rest period for the type of duty. So that's if you need to get a person in, you can reduce the minimum rest period by 1 hour. Notice there is no maximum shift length here given in exceptional circumstances because the circumstances are exceptional. If there is a train broken down in the middle of nowhere, in a snowstorm, in a blizzard, in the middle of the night, and no one can get to it, just because the driver, fireman and guard have got to 13 hours does not mean they can go home. Because no one can get home, they're still on duty, they're still expected to represent the company, and it'll just have to go on for as long as it goes on for, because there is literally no other option. As per the policy here, it would be impossible to make other arrangements. You can, of course, apply mitigation, as we'll see in a second when we look at the risk assessment, but if you're going to increase the shift length when it's not planned, you're only ever going to do it, and you must only ever do it if it is the least worst option and there is no other possible option. So there can be no maximum because you just go until there are other options or you can complete the task. These exceptions must be authorised on each occasion by the function supervisor, because remember, the function supervisor is the manager that's there on duty, following the risk assessment below on each occasion. Right, nearly at the end, we're on page 8 of 9, and then there's a form you'll be pleased to hear. So let's look at the risk assessment that we're going to follow if it's necessary for either the manager of the business unit or the function supervisor to allow somebody to work more than 12 or less than 11 hours rest. So Adam has pointed out that he would suggest that the wording should include that it has to be with the agreement of the individuals. Yeah, absolutely right. And in fact, here in the risk assessment, there it is. It's one of the questions that you have to ask in the risk assessment, but yet more than happy to put it further up in the text as well. But Adam is absolutely right that if the individual says, I don't want to go over the maximum length, then it's pretty difficult to force them. Of course, they are also obliged not to. They also have their own obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. They can't just walk away from an unsafe situation. If they're a signalman, for example, and their trains are all moving around on the panel area, they can't just say, oh, 12 hours, off I go, and leave the railway in an unsafe state. They would be obliged to, at the very least, get the railway into a safe state. But hopefully it will never be so extreme that we get to that stage. Right, so here's the risk assessment that we're going to follow. The following points must be considered. Question: is it absolutely necessary? Have all the other options been exhausted, such as job sharing? Is the member of staff willing to work the revised hours? Is the individual free of signs from fatigue? Obviously, that one's only applicable to an emergency deviation because you can't see them if it's planned. Is authorising the exception the least worst option? And the answers to all of those must be yes in order, for the manager to authorise the arrangements. And a record of this must be kept for 2 years on the form that we're going to look at in a little while. The individual must be advised to be mindful of their own well-being and report to their manager if they start to feel fatigued. And then we will take some steps to minimise the impact of the excessive shift length or reduced rest period. And there is more than two, it goes over the page. So first of all, transport could be provided for the member of staff to or from home to reduce the effect of driving fatigue. Could be, I'm not saying it always can, but it could be. Accommodation could be provided for the member of staff at or closer to the railway to reduce travelling time, which may even bring it within the normal policy, within the normal maximum shift length. So certainly if you have accommodation at the railway and the member of staff is happy to stay there tonight, then that could be a way of bringing everything back within the normal bounds of the policy. Additional rest breaks within the shift could be provided to reduce the accumulation of fatigue stress. A meal or other refreshment could be provided to the individual to help them maintain energy. The standard minimum rest period must be available to the person after an increased shift length before they book on for their next turn of duty. So if the rest period was already the minimum, and then you increase the shift length, you're not allowed to use that to reduce the minimum rest period. The rest period has got to stay the minimum length and be knocked on, and you've got to do something to cover the first part of the next shift. And obviously, we could go on and on forever. What happens if that can't be done? What's exceptional in that circumstance? But we're not going to go 27 levels deep down this. We apply the principles of the policy as they stand. The standard maximum shift length must be applied to any duty worked by a person following a reduced rest period. So if you've got them in an hour early on a 12-hour shift, then they need to go home an hour early. You can't say, come in an hour early, having had insufficient rest, and then work for a longer maximum shift length than we would otherwise have liked you to. And we must continue to look for another person to provide relief to limit the extent of the deviation from the normal standard. This also applies if a person is coming back after reduced rest. So even after you've authorised all this, and even while it's taking place, we should still put effort into looking for another person to provide relief if we can. Right, and finally in this document, you may have heard of the HSE Fatigue Risk Index, or the Fatigue and Risk Index. And we have not applied that here. And so we felt it was useful to put into the SMS the reasons why. And the first one is that the user guide for the HSE's Fatigue and Risk Index states that it is not appropriate for shift patterns that are predominantly day turns, which the majority of Heritage Railway shifts are, and those that aren't almost certainly aren't voluminous enough to make a significant difference. So you've always got to use the tool that's appropriate for the purpose, and the HSE Fatigue and Risk Index tool is designed for staff on rolling rosters, where they do earlies and then lates and then nights, or they do days and then nights, or whatever it is, to manage up that accumulation of fatigue. In the vast majority of cases, people that work on Heritage Railways don't work consecutive days. Even when they work consecutive days, it's not as significant a run of consecutive days as staff who do it for their full-time job. I should qualify again. Volunteer staff who work on Heritage Railways don't tend to do that many consecutive days. Of course, there may well be employee staff that do, and there may well be employees that do work that rotating shift pattern in order to keep a depot open or whatever it is 24/7, in which case the fatigue index is appropriate for you. But remember, we're trying to cover the majority of bases here in the template, and then you will need to make sure that it matches your local risks. What else have I said there? Yes, it does also not reflect the range and variation of travelling times, particularly for volunteers, and we felt it was very important to include those in the management of fatigue risk, which the HSE Fatigue Index, although has the facility to recognise travel times, not the range and variation that one single person might have in their travel times to and from the railway or other local hostel or wherever it is that they stay. So that's the end of the policy. I think I've talked that one to death. That's everything we could come up with from what people have sent in and what we've discussed in terms of the management of fatigue and control of working hours. There is one form here to help you record, or help the managers of the business units and the function supervisors record when they've authorised somebody to deviate from the normal hours allowed in the fatigue policy. It's very simple: name, date, time of inquiry, who it was completed it, and the member of staff's name, and whether it's a planned or an emergency deviation. It's all very simple stuff, but it's very important and very useful to have this available if there's an incident, to demonstrate that we were managing it before the incident occurred. And this is public information that's in the report. The signalman that was on duty at the Ladbroke Grove accident was working more shifts in a row than he otherwise would have done, but it was properly authorised, properly risk assessed, proper process went through. The irony is, the reason that was necessary was in order to release staff to attend the Southall inquiry. But it goes to show that incidents can happen at any time, and it would be very easy for us to get caught out if we had an incident during a time when we'd allowed somebody to go over our normal working time allowance, and we hadn't been seen to manage it properly. So for planned deviations, this must be completed by the manager of the business unit. For emergency deviations, it must be completed by the function supervisor, or of course the manager of the business unit if he's there. The following points must be considered. There's the same questions. There's an additional one which was a bullet point in the policy that says the individual is advised to be mindful of their own well-being and report to their manager if they start to feel fatigued. And you've got to be able to answer yes to all of these questions in this risk assessment form in order to proceed. Then here's steps that can be taken to minimise the impact of an excessive shift length or reduced rest, and they're exactly the same as what was in the policy, and you circle to say whether you provided them yes or no and your rationale for not being able to do so. So we should always apply mitigation if we can. We should have a reason why we can't. And it might just be that it's not possible, or that the logistics aren't in place, or there isn't time, or whatever it is. I'm not saying it's wrong not to provide them. I'm just saying if we're not going to provide them, let's record the rationale as to why, so that we can't be criticised for it later. It reiterates that the minimum rest period must still be available, the maximum shift length must be maintained, and efforts must continue to look for another person to provide relief. And then you either authorise it or you don't, and you sign and time. And in the occasion where it was completed by telephone, then you can record the details there if you can't obtain a proper signature because it was done by telephone. And hopefully that is sufficient to demonstrate that you were applying your policy, you have carried out this semblance of a risk assessment, and you did specifically authorise the person in accordance with the policy to go over the maximum allowed shift length or below the minimum rest period. Liz has pointed out, I wonder if anyone has considered fatigue management measures other than shift length, e.g. advice on sleep hygiene, hydration, and so on. We haven't, but it seems a next logical step. Yes, that's a very good idea. Because, as I mentioned earlier, just because we're complying with the policy does not mean we're completely immune from fatigue. And different people will get fatigued in different ways. So yeah, that's a good idea, and maybe something that we can include in the policy as well. So I'll try my best to go back to my slides. So it's your last opportunity now then to comment on anything that you still wish to. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking part. Remember what I said right at the beginning, that the workshop doesn't end just when the workshop ends. It goes on and on and on. So please do send in your comments, or if you've got a better system to feed into the best practice policy. I'll wait a week or so for the comments to dry up, and then I'll publish the best practice policy and all those research materials that I referred to in the workshops page on HOPS. The next SMS workshop is on Tuesday the 25th of May. Remember, these are every Tuesday or every 6 weeks on a Tuesday night. And what is the topic of that one? I don't know. Let's have a look. It will be the competence management for safety critical staff. So that's going to be quite a big topic, but we are not going to tackle every single safety critical grade on Tuesday the 25th of May. What we're going to tackle then is the policy for the competence management of safety critical staff, how it's managed as a process, what the generic terms are for how we assess and manage competence. In a future workshop, we will then look at a specific competence management policy for footplate staff, for signalmen, for dispatch, for P-way, all those sorts of things. And who knows, maybe in the future we'll even develop that further in other ways. But certainly 6 weeks from now, on Tuesday the 25th of May, it'll be competence management for safety critical staff as an overall policy. So thank you very much to everybody who has watched. There are a couple of final comments coming in. So Adam asks, where is the workshop page? Right, okay, yep, no problem. Let's move that a little bit. In fact, if I move it down so you can see the address bar as well, all you do, usual Heritage Ops URL and then /workshops, and it'll take you to the page that looks like the opening card of the presentation. And as I've been uploading the documents, I'm just turning it into a link, so that's where you can find it. Normal HOPS /workshops, and then if you click on the link, it'll take you to a page that's got the video embedded on it, the video of this workshop, the best practice templates, and the research, or the links to the research materials that we used in the creation of it all. So that's where you find it on HOPS. So let's just see what else has come in right at the end. Thank you very much, everyone, for all your positive comments. That's lovely. Tommy, but maybe this enter the check details update so the user can't book on. Right, so Thomas suggested about making it so that a user can't book on at duty on one railway and then be at another railway after that. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that at this stage, certainly. Maybe in the future we'll have some sort of cross-railway validation of when people are working and not working, and when the maximum limits are going to be broken. There are a few reasons why we're not going to do that right now. One is because every railway's policy is different, so it's going to be extremely difficult to reconcile what's acceptable and what isn't in order to provide that, to provide those alerts. And the other thing is, of course, the huge data protection and GDPR implications of doing that. So maybe in the future we might be able to do something along those lines, but I don't think the Heritage Railway world is quite ready for that yet. Okay, that's all I've got. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I hope you've all had fun. I look forward to all your comments coming in over the next week or so, and then I'll speak to you all again on Tuesday the 25th of May for competence management of safety critical staff. Thank you very much and good night.